Welcome to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. Well, it's no longer PorcFest, which means that I am hoarse, as you can probably tell. The reason I am hoarse is because, well, yes, I was talking a lot, but I was also screaming. Why was I screaming? Well, I was kind of trying to be a bit of a carnival barker because I was running a booth and I was selling product, and, well, I didn't really have as much foot traffic as in years past. Part of that had to do with the location. Part of that had to do with the slightly smaller crowd at PorcFest. That was the Porcupine Freedom Festival. There was a slightly smaller crowd than in years past. And, well, in years past, I have always sort of done the carnival barking thing, but I shouted a good bit more, trying to get attention of people. And that is why it sounds like I sound. So, I am going to go ahead and do the full 30-minute show, but then after the show today, I'm going to try resting my voice today as much as possible, rest my voice tomorrow as much as possible, and hopefully on Wednesday I sound like normal Darryl. And speaking of Wednesday, and hold on, before speaking of Wednesday, normal Darryl, there's no such thing as normal Darryl unless it's the whole, normal is relative thing. And I have long said that I'm the only normal person on the planet. It's everybody else that's weird. And that's because, normal is relative. So what I find to be normal, somebody else doesn't, and vice versa. So the normal Darryl quote was, you know what I'm trying to say, like the relative normal, not like societal normal. So Wednesday is the Ask Me Anything. It's going back to the regular Ask Me Anything where you send those questions to me, AMA@FPPradio.com, AMA Ask Me Anything, and I will literally answer any question. And what I did last week during PorcFest, if by some chance you missed any or all of those episodes, I did a 9-minute, I did one segment, so 9 minutes of Ask Me Anything, where I answered as many questions as possible. And I would have to say that my favorite question that I was asked was, what is the nature of the universe? And the reason that was my favorite is because, that's one of these rhetorical questions, because the universe is nature and the nature is universe. And it's one of these metaphysical, sit there and ponder it all day, and ultimately you wind up building a computer, and the computer says it's going to take 10 million years to answer the question, and then by the time the answer comes about, they forgot what the question was, and that's why we have Earth, according to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the answer, by the way, is 42. Something that is not the answer to life, the universe, and everything, or the meaning of whatever, is the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, they occasionally get things right, and they occasionally get things wrong. And when they get things wrong, they get them incredibly wrong. And no, I'm not talking about the same-sex marriage ruling that came out on Friday. I will talk about that briefly, but there was a ruling that came out earlier today about the death penalty. The story here comes from the New York Times, and they write, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Monday against 3 death row inmates who had sought to bar the use of an execution drug they said risked causing excruciating pain. And you may recall, I've talked about this a good bit before, and I've talked about how I think that the death penalty in and of itself, the way that it is currently carried out, is cruel and unusual punishment, because you're putting someone essentially in prison for who knows how long. There have been people that were exonerated after 39 years on death row, and come to find out, oh, well, they never should have been convicted in the first place. So for those 39 years, they were waiting and waiting and waiting, not to die, but to find out when they were going to die. So they were waiting. Is today the day I find out when I die? Is today the day I find out when I'm going to die? Is today, every day that they wake up, they have to wonder, is today the day I find out when I'm going to die? And that is mental torture. However, the U.S. Supreme Court was not asked that question. And that's the way courts operate. They can only ask the question that is answered. That's not the way I operate on Ask Me Anything. You ask me a question and I'll take it on 27 different tangents. So the question before the court was whether or not the drug midazolam was in violation of the U.S. Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The article here continues, and I'll get into the topic of midazolam just a little bit more. The article continues, Justice Samuel Alito wrote the majority opinion in the 5-4 decision. He was joined by the court's 4 more conservative justices. The drug, midazolam, played a part in 3 long, apparently painful executions last year. And they say apparently painful because the person died. You can't ask them, was this painful? One of those executions was for a man named Clayton Lockett. He did some horrible things. I'm not defending Clayton Lockett at all. What I am going to say is that when he was executed, he sat, or rather laid on the gurney and convulsed for an incredibly long time before dying of heart failure. That's not the way the lethal injection is supposed to work. The lethal injection drugs are supposed to work like when you put a dog to sleep, where you give them the drugs and they just doze off to sleep and then they never wake up again. But the way this drug works, because the jails aren't able to get the drugs that they actually want from the manufacturers in Europe, because the manufacturers in Europe say we're not going to sell these if they're going to be used for an execution, so you can't have any. So they're, all right, well, we'll just experiment with some stuff. And they're experimenting with some stuff, and they wound up causing a guy to have a heart attack. And people that support the death penalty say, well, he wound up dead, didn't he? And, of course, yes, he wound up dead, but that's not the point. If you just want to, cause someone to wind up dead, cut their Achilles tendon, cut right above and below the knees, and then shoot them in the stomach. They'll die. It'll take a while, but they'll die. Is the point to kill people? Is the point of the death penalty to serve as a deterrent? Is the point to make sure that you execute the right person? And if the point is to make sure you execute the right person, should it not be done in a manner that at least has some sort of dignity for the person that you're killing? If you just want to go kill people because, well, they did something wrong, so let's kill them, well, bring back the firing squad and a lynch mob. But that's not what I'm all about. If it's about justice, then make sure it's done right. And yes, I'm getting even more hoarse than I was at the beginning of the show, but I'll continue because that's what I do. This is Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Stay tuned. Find out more about this horribly flawed Supreme Court ruling when we come back.
Why do they hate us? Is libertarianism compatible with Islam? Davi Barker answers these questions and more in Voluntary Islam and Other Essays. He advances the voluntarist cause with analysis of the confluence of values between Islam and libertarianism, as well as contemporary movements from the Tea Party to the Arab Spring. Voluntary Islam by Davi Barker is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
It is the year 91,001 BCE. Witness humanity's origins in Hyperchronius, a classic role-playing game for Windows PCs, with a story like no other game before. A liberty-oriented experience that is not to be missed. Go to zog.ninja to get your copy of Hyperchronius today. Use the code FPP to get $1 off. Hyperchronius, zog.ninja, code FPP.
In 2115 New England, there are no borders, no states, and no regulations, yet never has a more peaceful and prosperous place existed. But Mr. Drake's security company has seen better days. Faced with the prospect of waning power, Mr. Drake intends to replace the anarchy of New England with a government. But at what cost? And can anyone stop him? Anarchy in New England by Joe Jarvis is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. And yes, that is where you can find all of the archives going back all 196 episodes of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. This is episode 196. Go all the way back. In the early episodes, you may remember I did interviews. And some of those interviews I have pulled out, and I'm putting those in a special area on my hard drive titled Bonus Content for a Rebel's Journey. And you have probably heard the ad. I've got it running in the ads, and it also runs on LRN, which is one of the outlets where this show is heard in the podcast loop. So I wrote a book, and it took me a while to write the book. And I'm glad that it took me as long as it did. And it's one of these weird things to where, like, it was several years in the making, but it wasn't me working on it every day over several years. It was me working on it a little bit here, a little bit there, getting stuck, trying to figure out where to go, how to proceed. Several months later, looking at it again. Where do I go? How do I proceed? Et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, I was determined I'm finishing this as soon as possible. Had a friend help me compile some information that I had previously written. Use that not as the articles or the chapters in the book, but to sort of help me gather my thoughts and how to proceed. So I've got a fundraiser up right now. If you go to arebelsjourney.com, that's all one word, no special punctuation, arebelsjourney.com. You can find out, watch the pitch video, find out more about the fundraiser, and donate. And one of the perks is bonus audio. And the bonus audio, I've got interviews from Ben Stone, Stefan Kinsella, Lynn Albrecht, Gardner Goldsmith, and a few others as bonus audio. So if you donate above a certain threshold, when you wind up getting the audio book, you will get the bonus audio. If you don't want to donate that much or can't afford to donate that much, you could still possibly wind up getting the bonus audio. It's all of the info is there in the pitch. And please donate, because what I'm trying to do is give away the book, but still be recouped for the efforts. So go donate. If I don't meet the fundraising goal, then whoever donates will still get the perks that they were going to get. I'm just not going to give the book away. I'll still sell it fairly cheaply, but it will not be free. The audiobook and the ebook will not be completely free. The physical book, there's going to be various prices on that, but it's still going to be as cheap as possible if I get at least half of the goal. So go to arebelsjourney.com to find out more and to donate. And yes, I do take Bitcoin, or you can use a good old-fashioned credit or debit card through the Indiegogo that is linked there from A Rebel's Journey. That's arebelsjourney.com. So back to the article here from the New York Times. They write, the drug, the sedative midazolam, played a part in 3 long and apparently painful executions last year. It was used in an effort to render inmates unconscious before they were injected with other severely painful drugs. 4 condemned inmates in Oklahoma challenged the use of the drug, saying it did not reliably render the person unconscious and thus violated the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The lower courts disagreed. Oklahoma and several other states started to use midazolam in executions after manufacturers in Europe and the United States refused to sell them the barbiturates that were traditionally used to produce unconsciousness in lethal injection. Lawyers for the Oklahoma inmates, with the support of experts in pharmacology and anesthetics, said midazolam, even if properly administered, was unreliable. They pointed to the 3 executions gone awry last year. In April 2014, Clayton Lockett, who I mentioned earlier, regained consciousness during the execution. This is something that I totally, either I missed it or I forgot about it, but it says here he regained consciousness during his execution. He was writhing and moaning after the intravenous line was improperly placed. In Ohio in January of last year and in Arizona of July, prisoners appeared to gasp and choke for extended periods. And that's what happened to Clayton Lockett after he's sitting there writhing, he is gasping and whatever, and then died of heart failure. Justice Alito wrote that the inmates had failed to identify, that being the inmates who sued, had failed to identify an available and preferable method of execution, or to make the case that the challenged drug entailed a substantial risk of severe pain. In dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor joined the other 3 members of the court's liberal wing. And I hate when they say, the conservative wing and the liberal wing, because they're really both the same wing on the vulture of the government. But nonetheless, they refer to, a right wing and a left wing, a liberal, conservative, but they're all really the same. They're there to further the government. That's what the court does. They recently upheld the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act as being legal and constitutional, even though, that, in my opinion, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that authorizes that. But nonetheless, government grows, and that's what happens. So the article here says that the liberal justices said, quote, the court's available alternative requirement leads to patently absurd consequences. Petitioners contend that Oklahoma's current protocol is a barbarous method of punishment, the chemical equivalent of being burned alive. She wrote, but under the court's new rule, it would not matter whether the state intended to use midazolam or instead have petitioners drawn and quartered, slowly tortured to death, or actually burned at the stake. Also in dissent, Justice Stephen Breyer, joined by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said it was time to consider a larger issue. Justice Breyer wrote, quote, rather than try to patch up the death penalty's legal wounds one at a time, I would ask for a full briefing on a more basic question, whether the death penalty violates the Constitution. And this is what I was talking about, where the court can only answer the question that was asked of them. The court cannot decide to go on a tangent and answer the larger question. The court, however, can say we need to look at the larger question and write that into their opinion. And that's what one of the dissenting judges said, is that we need to look at whether or not the death penalty, as it is currently in practice, violates the U.S. Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. And I would love for the court to hear this. And I would love, if there's an attorney that does pro bono work, I would love to write an amicus brief. Not because I think that I'm ever going to wind up being on death row, but because I could bring a different perspective. I don't know of anybody that is saying it's cruel and unusual punishment to put somebody on death row for 39 years, causing them to wake up every day wondering, is today the day I find out when I'm going to die? That is mentally torturous. That is cruel. That is unusual. There's more when we come back on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio.
Why do they hate us? Is libertarianism compatible with Islam? Davi Barker answers these questions and more in Voluntary Islam and Other Essays. He advances the voluntarist cause with analysis of the confluence of values between Islam and libertarianism, as well as contemporary movements from the Tea Party to the Arab Spring. Voluntary Islam by Davi Barker is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
It is the year 91,001 BCE. Witness humanity's origins in Hypercronius, a classic role-playing game for Windows PCs, with a story like no other game before. A liberty-oriented experience that is not to be missed. Go to zog.ninja to get your copy of Hypercronius today. Use the code FPP to get $1 off. Hypercronius, zog.ninja, code FPP.
In 2115 New England, there are no borders, no states, and no regulations, yet never has a more peaceful and prosperous place existed. But Mr. Drake's security company has seen better days. Faced with the prospect of waning power, Mr. Drake intends to replace the anarchy of New England with a government. But at what cost? And can anyone stop him? Anarchy in New England by Joe Jarvis is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So, getting back to the story here from the New York Times, they write, the Supreme Court last considered lethal injection in 2008 in the case of Bays v. Reese, when it held that what was then the standard three-drug combination, using the barbiturate sodium thiopental as the first agent, did not violate the Eighth Amendment. The new case, Glossop v. Gross, originally included a fourth inmate, Charles F. Warner, but he was executed on January 15th after the U.S. Supreme Court denied his request for a stay by a vote of 5-4. A little more than a week later, the court agreed to hear the remaining inmates' appeals, and a few days after that, it stayed their executions. So this is something that I find incredibly interesting. So the court was asked the question of whether or not Charles Warner should be allowed to be part of this case. Should he be allowed to, should the execution be stayed, allow him to be part of this case, and then set the execution after the case is decided? They said no. A couple days later, we're taking this case, and everybody else's execution is stayed until the outcome. So that just seems to be, I don't think that, insult to injury is really the right term, but that's pretty much what it is. Of, okay, go ahead, die, and, the three co-plaintiffs, you get to live just a little bit longer, and now you're going to die at some point. Who knows how long it's going to be before the other three plaintiffs in this case wind up finding out when they die. And again, this is one of the things that really irks me about the way the death penalty is carried out. Aside from the fact that it's the government doing it, and they have been wrong a large percentage of the time. And yes, I know, some people are going to say, well, it doesn't have to be that way. They don't have to be wrong. True, they don't have to do anything, but that's what they do. Like, if you're looking at the scientific method, and I'm not necessarily a scientist, but I understand the scientific method, where you look at patterns, and you look at history, and when this happens, and when this happened, that happened. And then you can sort of, predict outcomes. And let me go off on another tangent. There's not really much more to this article. There's about another paragraph, but let me go off on a tangent about a conversation that I had at PorcFest with someone who said that he's a recovering anarchist. That was not really the term he used. He used the term of, I'm now a minarchist, I used to be an anarchist. So I'm just going to say he's a recovering anarchist. And based on the conversation we were having, it sounds as though he did not really fully understand the philosophy, if you will, of no state. And so for anybody that's stumbling across this and doesn't understand the term minarchy or anarchist and minarchist, a minarchist is someone who believes in a minimal government. And that definition of what is a minimal government depends on who you talk to. The term anarchist means someone who does not believe in a ruler. An meaning no, archy meaning ruler, so no rulers. And, it can be argued that the term itself is flawed because you rule yourself, and so therefore, if you are your own ruler, then there is a ruler, so you can't be an anarchist. So autarchist would probably be the correct term if I'm using an archy term. Archy, again, ruler. If I'm using one of those terms, like minarchy, monarchy, anarchy, I would use the term anti-archist, meaning that I'm opposed to the concept of rulers. I'm opposed to the concept of coercive rulers. Let me put in that added word. So the conversation that we were having was about poor people. And we need the government. This was the argument that was being made. He said, we need the government because poor people. And me and one other person, we were the ones that he approached with this thought. We said, wait a second, but let's look at what's happening now. This is what's happening. 75 cents of every dollar that is designated for this is going to help poor people winds up going to the middle-class bureaucrats designated or whatever to help the poor. So 75% is wasted. With private charity, 75% actually goes to help the people that are supposed to be helped. The other 25% goes towards overhead costs. So paying the light bill, paying rent, giving people small salaries. 75% actually goes to helping the poor that are there for help. So he said, well, it doesn't have to be that way. Well, true, it doesn't, but that's what is happening. And let's look at there are rules and regulations that prevent private charity from doing certain things. There are laws that prohibit people from giving food away. In places with such laws, and I've talked a good bit about this, there was the case down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where the 93-year-old minister was arrested for feeding the homeless. That's what happens. And he said, well, it doesn't have to be that way. In Louisiana, there was some hunters organization that donated food to a homeless shelter. It was not in the proper packaging. So the Department of Food, or whatever the hell it was down in Louisiana, confiscated the food from the homeless shelter. They didn't just confiscate the food. They put it in a big barrel and poured bleach on it so that nobody could eat it. That's what happens. And he said, but it doesn't have to be that way. True, it doesn't. You can have a benevolent dictator that provides everything for everybody. And what happens when that dictator that is benevolent goes away? And then you see, let's look at history. This is what happens. In the 1930s, this is what happened when regulations started being put in place and government said, we'll do it. So they put up all of these roadblocks and say, well, you can't do this, only we can do this. You can't do that, only we can do that. And then people ask the question, why is charity not doing this? See, this is why we need government. But look, the government put all these roadblocks. Well, they didn't have to put roadblocks. They just thought it was best. Yeah, and that's what happens. So same thing with death penalty. Like, it doesn't have to be carried out in an extremely flawed manner in which, probably 10% of the people that are killed are actually innocent. It doesn't have to be that way. True, it doesn't have to be that way, but it is. That's what happens. And the 10% number that I came up with, that's based on the limited info that we have of how many people have been exonerated while on death row, how many people have been exonerated after they were executed, and then from there you can do statistics and run the math of this is how many people have been executed, this is how many have been exonerated, this is how many were exonerated post-mortem, and there's probably more that have been executed that probably should have been exonerated, but the evidence is being hidden. This is Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Don't forget, there's the Ask Me Anything on Wednesday, AMA at FPPradio.com.